I'm Bill Wilt of Assured Research. Thanks for tuning in to this, what is part two of our May 2025 Assured Briefing Note called Social Inflation Hits Insurers, Less So Economies. I'm going to assume many or most of you will have watched the first video, so we'll dispense with some of the introductory remarks, and I'll just jump into it. And as I do, remind you that this was kind of a standalone itself, a standalone note, but also I think we presented it as an addendum to the first, really getting to the same idea is that social inflation hits insurers, less so economies. But what's different about the analyses in the second part of the note is that. And let me just share this. Sorry, that'll make it better. What's better, or what's different rather, about this second note is that rather than including premiums, we to look at loss ratios. Remember, state economies, loss ratios, and liability scores. In this case, we're looking at the liability burden, which we're just removing premium from the equation. We just look at calendar year liability losses by state and over time in relation to state GDP. And in so doing, we've kind of removed some of the pricing cycle and some intentional decisions by insurers to gain share or lose share. And we're just looking at more of the liability costs, influenced by insurance and the hardening and softening and adding or subtracting coverages, but nevertheless maybe a cleaner view of liability costs in relation to GDP. And what you see on the left-hand side, that liability burden is on the y-axis. The liability score is on the x-axis. Remember, higher is better. States with better tort systems. Lower is weaker states. I think some of the hellhole states there would be in the lower left, or would be in the left on the x-axis. And you don't see much relationship, and that broadly squares with what we observed in this report and in the first video, is that the data wouldn't support the assertion that there's a strong link between a state's economy and their ability to grow faster or growing slower than the national average and their liability score. Weak, very weak, negative or inverse relationship here, which you would expect. States with high liability scores, strong tort systems, you would think that they would have a noticeably lower relationship between GDP and, between liability costs and GDP. The reality is it's maybe a little bit lower on balance, but again, not statistically credible. Doesn't suggest that states shouldn't pursue reform, but it's not a strong signal. On the right-hand side, so you have it, you can see the liability burden by state. This is the recent 3-year average. Not a surprise that New York there is among the highest. Delaware is quite high, and they actually much higher than the national average because of a really particularly bad year in 22, I want to say. But Delaware would be quite high if it was included. You see Connecticut, but also among the larger states, Georgia and Florida, for instance, the dark colors there indicating that they have higher than national average levels of liability costs in relation to GDP. I thought this was interesting, again, somewhat backward looking, or it is backward looking, but still interesting to see GDP, the liability burden by state and by year, and just the dispersion, both the level and dispersion. The boxes measure the middle 50% of the distribution. The line is the median. So you see from the kind of the mid 20 teens coming forward in time, you see the rise in the liability burden, consistent with what we know, that it's a period of social inflation, liability losses growing faster than can be reasonably explained by changes in exposure or changes in economic inflation. Another way of saying that is the residual trend has been accelerating since the mid 20 teens, but also you see the variability increasing. And what the graph on the right is illustrating, mathematically, what you kind of probably intuitively observed looking at the graph on the left, is that the upside variance is has increased faster and by more than the downside variance. That's what the graph on the right is illustrating. Kind of relatively easy to see in the graph on the left that the upside variability is accelerating. So things have gotten worse. If it feels like things have gotten worse, it's because they have. And I'll end with this as to slides with this, which is again a kind of a statistical analysis to when you put all the states, we average their liability score, compare the average of their liability burden, liability over GDP, with their liability score. Remember, higher is better, lower is worse. Pardon me, we just plotted them and then said, okay, which of these states kind of how would one group these states? Useful one would, I'm hoping for you all as you evaluate the liability environments in your states, the loss experience, underwriting, maybe which states get particular attention, where to grow, where to grow more cautiously. You all will decide how to use this. But what this is showing is on the y-axis, the liability burden, somewhere around 30 basis points. Above 30 basis points, the loss experience starts to get worse. If you look at a lot of the states above 30 basis points, it's interesting they have diverse liability scores, so it's hard to maybe pigeonhole them as to the veracity of their liability system. But once the liability burden is above 30 basis points, a lot of these states have high liability loss ratios. So it would, Florida, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, certainly Nevada, New York. The idea I would gather is that there is some level of legal activity above which it becomes difficult to maybe the trend is so high it's difficult to even price for it. Would be one interpretation. Illinois there is on the well above 30, but it's on the left with a weak liability system. So that would be maybe one takeaway from those states above 30 basis points. Look at the lower left. States that are near 30 basis points, like Georgia, Texas is a bit below, but California, Louisiana with weak on the liability scores, there too, they're a bit below 30, but couple that high liability burden with a weak liability score, and those states tended to have higher liability loss ratios. The good news is, and there is some good news. If you look at the states clustered in the on the lower right quadrant, those are states better liability scores, lower liability burdens, presumably, and lots of those are states that were green on some of our earlier maps showing lower than national average liability loss ratios, presumably a more manageable level of legal activity, easier to price, maybe perhaps better to underwrite. The challenge, as always, I've noted a couple times now, is that a lot of those states in the lower right are the smaller states. And so it's difficult to avoid all the others because they represent such a big portion of GDP. No slide for it, but I'll end on this note. We've looked back with an eye toward Georgia and the comprehensiveness of its liability reforms. One would think that should shrink the denominator in the liability burden, should shrink the volume of their liability losses. It probably will because it's so comprehensive. And when we looked back at Texas in the early 2000s, Texas's liability burden went from, I want to say, a peak of about 45 basis points down to maybe into the teens or the very low 20s. That reform, the comprehensiveness of it, really did do a good job of shrinking the liability costs. So, be watching for Georgia. These could do the same thing, which would certainly be good for liability underwriters. Texas did and has increased in the 15 plus years, a couple of decades since those reforms. So nothing lasts forever. So that's the good news. Maybe the slightly less good news drawn out in our research note is that we have looked back over the last, say, 6 years and found 7 instances where states kind of implemented some level of tort reform, but it wasn't particularly comprehensive. It was maybe one element of the many elements of the Georgia reform. There, it's less convincing, and there's really no consequential statistical evidence that those instances of relatively more minor reforms meaningfully shrunk the denominator in this liability burden. So, food for thought, more in the note. Thanks so much for your interest in our work, and have a great rest of your day.